welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Galen Barbos with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, joined here by my colleagues Sunhee Vaik and JP Carvalho. And we are excited to share with you today a new tool called PRESTO that we just recently released, as well as a case study demonstrating how one might use this tool specifically to analyze the backup power capabilities of behind-the-meter solar and storage during short-duration power interruptions. So we're excited to talk more with you about this tool and this analysis. Before we get started, though, I'm going to just run through the typical housekeeping items in advance. So first, I'll just note that this webinar is being recorded. We'll be posting a recording of the webinar along with the slides in the next day or two, and we'll send an email out to everybody who registered for the webinar, letting you know where you can find those items once they're up. And then second, we are hoping to save at least 15 minutes or so at the end for Q&A. And so hopefully you can all see the Q&A box in your webinar console or button. And so as we go through this material, I would just encourage you to enter in your questions as we go. We'll be compiling them and getting them queued up for the session at the end. So please don't be shy. And with that, let's begin. So JP, if you could advance to the table of contents slide. So we're going to do a little bit of tag team here. I'm going to start off by giving just some general background and context for this work. I'll then hand it over to JP, who will present PRESTO, talk about kind of what this tool is, what it does, how we developed it. He'll then hand it over to Sunhee, who will talk about the case study analysis, showing how you can use this tool to analyze the backup power capabilities of solar and storage. So with that, next slide. So PRESTO and this case study analysis were developed as part of a larger multi-year research project that's focused on analyzing the capabilities of behind-the-meter solar and storage in backup power applications. And this ongoing research area includes a number of different studies that broadly aim to evaluate backup power performance of solar and storage across a broad range of different geographies, different types of buildings, and different interruption conditions, including both short duration and long duration power interruptions. This work also involves analyses looking at some of the interactions between solar and storage and other distributed energy resources. We have a study that will be coming out in the next couple of weeks that specifically looks at how the backup power capabilities of solar and storage will be impacted as buildings become progressively more efficient, more flexible, and more electrified over time. Another dimension of this work involves looking at trade-offs between the use of solar and storage for backup power and other competing uses. And the case study that Sunhee will be presenting today touches on some of those issues. And then finally, and not incidentally, this work involves the development of various data and tools, most importantly, PRESTO, which of course we'll be talking about at length today. So next slide, please, JP. So here I just wanted to share very briefly some illustrative results from some of our prior work. And this work, as you can see here, this map, it shows backup performance of a typical residential solar and storage system over a series of 3-day power interruptions. I don't really want to talk too much about the specific results here. That you can see there are some interesting geographical trends based on the location of electric resistance heating and cooling loads around the country. But mostly I wanted to share this with you really for two reasons. One, to just note that through this ongoing work, we've developed a number of different tools and capabilities. PRESTO is, of course, one of those, but there are others as well. And the case study analysis that Sunhee will present draws on a number of these other data sets and tools that we've developed and that she'll be discussing. And then secondly, I just wanted to mention that most of our work up to this point has really been focused on long duration power interruptions. And long duration interruptions in many cases are driven by extreme weather events. And customers often, not always, but often have some ability to anticipate those events and make sure that their storage systems are charged up in advance. Most power interruptions, of course, are short duration and are pretty unpredictable. And so because we wanted to better understand and be able to evaluate how solar and storage might be useful as a backup power resource for those types of events, we really needed to develop some capability to simulate how typical short duration power interruption events occur. They're unpredictable, they're fairly random, though depending where you are in the country, they may also follow some general kind of trends in terms of the seasons in which they tend to occur, the times of day in which they tend to occur. And so we wanted to be able to capture that. And that was one of the motivations behind the development of PRESTO. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to JP, who will talk more about PRESTO.
Thanks, Galen, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm going to spend a little bit of time introducing the tool. I'm going to then swap to my browser to showcase a quick demo of the tool, and then I'll come back and spend a little bit of time sort of showing what's going on inside the tool and how its logic works from a higher level, just not to throw too much technical and jargon aspects to our audience. So as Galen was saying, PRESTO was developed to enable the analysis of solar plus storage backup power applications, but it is generally applicable to analyzing or to modeling short duration power interruptions and analyzing any type of mitigation measure against those, be it technical measures or behavioral measures. PRESTO was created in part to fill a gap in customer level power interruption data. And this comes about because the existing potential data sources that are comparable are either proprietary or not publicly available, or rather insufficient. And we're listing 3 of them: utility data that tends to be typically clustered at the circuit or feeder level, and whatever is publicly available is reported at an aggregate annual level that it's insufficient. Smart meter data, that could be the gold standard, is typically unavailable in a public way. And then the traditional way in which these kinds of simulations have been performed by distribution system planners have been using asset level outages that require a lot of knowledge, a complete knowledge of the topology and infrastructure of the distribution system, neither of which tends to be available. And even in the cases where some empirical data is available, as Galen was alluding, the types of events that we want to simulate are stochastic in nature. So unless you had a really thorough historical source of data, you wouldn't have enough ability to capture the wide range of situations that customers may face. So in brief, how the PRESTO model was developed was to simulate generate realistic profiles that encompass the timing, the duration, and the frequency of short duration interruptions. And it's largely derived and trained from a data set collected by poweroutages.us, which we refer to as POUS hereinforth, and which is really a set of wave scrape data from utilities that report on their outage web pages across the country. And so the data set that we have and train the model with ranges about 5 years, from mid-2017 to late 2021. And then we do a statistical analysis of this historical data to design the model and to calibrate the different inputs. And this is what I'm going to cover in a little bit after the demo that I'm going to do right now. So you can easily access PRESTO in presto.lvl.gov, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. So exiting the presentation and going here online to the model, you'll see that the model is largely frame with two types of users in mind: a graphical user interface that allows a county by county analysis, and sometimes a multi-county analysis, but limited to a smaller amount, that provides results right away. And then an application programming interface that allows users to send requests, programmatic requests to Presto, and then load much larger data sets for many counties and simulation designs. And so I'm going to demo specifically the UI, the user interface component. So as you log into Presto in the UI, you will be offered a map of the United States, the continental United States, and apologies for Alaska and Hawaii folks, but this is the data that's mostly available in the web scraping process from power outages. So I'm going to choose a random location. I have not prepared this in particular, and just showing that in this case, I chose a Missouri county. And then I can choose to run the model right away or configure some reliability metrics. And in this space is where we can use knowledge that we have from that particular county to provide an average duration per month and average frequency per month that we know the particular customer or area that we're simulating is affected by or characterized by. In this case, the model is already offering default values that we have extracted from both poweroutages.us and EIA 861 form. And so the customer or the user can decide to input and manually modify these values, or they could also provide a single annual value that then Presto distributes in a monthly basis based on its own internal profiles. So this is kind of the easiest way to use the model. So you have a single saliency fee, a single duration and frequency value that characterizes the interruptions of the customers you want to simulate, and you put that value there, and then the model does the rest for you. But again, if you have more detailed information like monthly values, or you want to use the defaults, that's the easiest way to move forward. Once you have this, you just run the model. Down here, I clicked. Right now, the model is simulating 1,000 instances. You can crank this up all the way to 20,000. Let's say if I do maybe 12,000, we get a different outcome. And in this case, there are multiple visualization. I'm not going to cover them all, but this is showing histograms of duration and frequency that gives a sense of how the particular customer or area that we're simulating is characterized. So you can see here, this is characterized by what looks to be a mean value of about an hour, maybe less than that, and with some tail end interruptions in the 8 to 9 hour range, which is the longest that a customer here would be able to endure. And the frequency you can see here, the model is suggesting that on average, probably it's 2 to 3 events per year, but there are some instances where you can reach 12 to 13. And let me clarify what we're seeing here in terms of a simulation. We understand that each simulation is quote unquote a prototypical year that a customer would suffer. So in this case, the model is producing 12,300 years of potential interruptions that a customer could suffer. Each one of these years has a number of events that are characterized by a duration, a frequency, by a duration and a timing of that interruption in terms of month and time of day. And I'll show in the how in the output that's very easily accessible. But that's how we understand the model. So essentially, when you run through 1,000 simulations, what we're doing is for a single customer thinking that they're going through 12,000 possible instances of interruptions that they could suffer, all stochastic based on the particular characteristics of the area where they live. The model offers a number of other visuals that I'm not going to cover. There are profiles in different temporal resolutions, as well as simple tables where we can verify, for example, some of the numbers that I was gleaning from the histograms, that, for example, the mean duration in this particular case was 1.7 hours, and there is about 4 average interruptions per year for this particular set of customers. So let me go back to the presentation now and describe a little bit more detail what's going on inside the model. So as I mentioned, the key set of input data is the power outages data set. That is, again, a collection of utilities outage reporting from their web pages. The data comes in an 8760 format, and what we get is the hourly counts of customers that are interrupted by a utility county combination. And so we have an hourly recording of the maximum number of customers that are tracked. And so what we do here is identify the duration and number of customers affected by non-continuous events. So we try to identify events that are continuous or that are single events based on the change of customers. And in that way, with these events IDs, we're able to characterize the types of events that are occurring in this county. Once we have this input data well structured, meaning hourly data sets of all these types of events, we apply standard time series decomposition techniques. And I'm not going to go in detail here, but essentially what we do is that we take this 5-year profile that you see here at the top of this chart, and we decompose it in 3 different components, what's called a seasonal trend, a trend, and a random component. And in particular, the seasonal one, as you see, allows us to extract the typical yearly profile. You can see it is not a coincidence that you see 4 shapes there that are repeating. That means that the model, the analysis is extracting the component that characterizes the typical yearly profile for that particular county. And with that and other manipulations, we're able to produce these types of likelihood components. And so we produce 2 of them. To the left is what we call the weekly likelihood, which describes what are the chances of a customer suffering an interruption in this particular county on a given week of the year. The idea here is to reflect the seasonality elements that you can see in this particular county that it's being showcased here in this chart. It is more likely to suffer interruptions towards the middle of the year, towards the summer, and there are some little late fall likelihoods also of having interruptions as well. To the right, we do an hour of day per month likelihood analysis, and this way we can characterize and determine what is most likely a customer suffer, what is the time of day in which interruptions could hit. And this is of course very relevant because the time of day indeed is one of the aspects that drives these outcomes as it relates to the state of charge of a battery that's being used for multiple other uses, as well as a PV system that's feeding into the PV storage system that also has a very, of course, determined temporal generation profile. In this particular case, you can see, for example, in the month of May has a marked likelihood of evening interruptions that could indeed drive some of the outputs. If you think about it, in a PV plus storage system, the storage system may be at the lowest at that time of day, and then interruptions will hit. As opposed to June, where it is a flatter profile, it is equally likely to have an interruption in either time of the day. So this chart here is meant to kind of give you a sort of final or a complete overview of the different pieces that I've been discussing. So to the left here, the calibration processes using the web scrape data from utilities, then the user input for potential overriding of the default duration and frequency calibrations, and then leveraging this likelihood weekly and time of day likelihoods, we go through these 4 steps where we draw frequencies from this calibrated probability distribution that describes how likely am I to suffer a given an event or a number of events on a given year. And then we assign a week to each one of these events based on the likelihoods. And then the next steps, depending on the month where these events are occurring, then we assign an hour of day that is most likely to occur. And all this is done randomly. So on average, for example, remembering that month of May that I showed, you would expect that on average, most interruptions occur in the evening. But of course, you will have 1 or 2 interruptions, a number that are happening randomly in other times. But that's the richness of the model, is that it offers an expectation or an average behaviors that are based on the historical data, but it remains stochastic in essence. And then the final 4th step is, as we have each event characterized by a month, a week, and a time of day event, we assign a random duration that is again based on the probability of suffering certain durations calibrated by the model. And so in certain areas of the country, these durations will be longer, and you see those histograms that I show will be extending much longer to the right, and others will be much shorter. And again, this duration will be stochastic. You'll have a random 8-hour interruption in a place that maybe suffers on average a half hour, but that 8-hour interruption will be much more rare. So I'm just going to quickly end up my section of presenting the PRESTO tool by stating that we conducted a number of validation processes. I'm going to just mention what kinds of processes we did. We validated against the training data against the empirical aggregates reported by utilities. And so what we did is that we took our training data that is on an hourly basis and aggregated it at an annual basis, which matches the EIA form A61 resolution. And we established that on average, we're in pretty good shape. There are, of course, some differences, some departures, and we calculated something between a 20 to 25% departure on average, but in general, our trend is central compared to those aggregates. We compare the PRESTO outputs against the training data, and we also compress the PRESTO outputs against the little non-training data that we had available with satisfactory results. But this is a space where we would like in the near future to partner, for example, with utilities or other or smart meter or data owners that we can use to keep refining our estimates. And so what you're seeing down here is the bullet that is in red. So this shows to the left the empirical weekly likelihood, and to the right what is the output of a 15,000 instance run on PRESTO. And you can see that they're very, very closely matching. And the same with the overall day likelihood, since that's more higher resolution. It is following the same profiles, albeit with a little difference here or there. But in general, you can see that the model is capturing the key hour of day and weekly likelihoods that it was trained with. So with that explanation of the PRESTO, I'm going to move down, pass it to Sanhee, who will cover a case study application of this model.
Alrighty, thank you, JP. Now I will talk about how PRESTO can be used to assess the reliability benefits of solar+storage system. Next slide, please. The early adoption of the behind-the-meter solar+storage system is often driven by the concerns about reliability and resilience. In our prior research, we've concentrated on assessing how PVSS system can mitigate the impacts of extended power outages. However, there is still a significant gap when it comes to understanding how PVSS system perform during short duration interruptions. These short duration interruptions can happen frequently throughout the year, vary in duration, and often follow distinct patterns. Additionally, the state of the charge of the battery can depending on when the power interruptions occur, and the effectiveness of the PVSS system in mitigating these interruptions can differ based on how customers utilize the battery on a day-to-day basis. To address these questions, we utilize PRESTO to create realistic simulation of short duration power interruptions and evaluated how well a PVSS system can provide backup power during these events, taking into consideration their unpredictable nature. Next slide, please. Yeah, to assess the reliability benefits of the solar+storage system, we mainly leverage the battery dispatch model, which has been utilized for our previous studies for evaluating the resilience value of solar+storage system and the effects of energy efficiency, load flexibility, and electrification. We modified the model to better understand the advantages of the solar+storage system during short duration power interruptions. And to achieve these goals, the model directly reads the PRESTO outputs instead of relying on synthetic scenarios, and then incorporating the battery state of the charge, which is optimized to maximize the solar+storage system's economic benefits based on the system configuration and time of the use rate for each of the region. And then all these numbers were calculated by NRES re-opt model. Next slide, please. Yeah. And in this case study, we considered 3 counties representing different climates and end-use loads. And then they are Maricopa, Middlesex, and Los Angeles. And we modeled the solar PV system size to meet each customer's annual electricity consumption, coupled with a 10 kilowatt-hour battery. We assumed that customers would charge their batteries solely from solar generation and schedule their daily charging and discharging cycles to minimize electricity costs under the local utilities time of use rate structure. For each county, we analyzed 3 different set of end-use categories to evaluate the PVSS system performance and under varying load conditions. The first category is limited critical loads, and these include refrigeration, nighttime lighting, and 7 watts of basic plug loads. And then the second category is critical loads. And then this encompasses the limited critical loads and the essential heating and cooling loads. And then the last one is whole building loads, And then this includes all appliances and devices in the home. Next page, please. Yeah, so the crucial input for this type of analysis is the data on short duration power interruptions. So for each of the county, monthly SAIDI and safety values that are adjusted by EIA's reliability metrics for the past 5 years were fed into PRESTO. And then that PRESTO generates the outage logs. And then these logs include the information about each simulated outage's week, day, hour, and duration. Next page, please. So we ran PRESTO for 1,000 simulation for each county. And then here I'm showing the result of Maricopa, which is our base study region. In Maricopa, our the PRESTO generated 1,520 interruption events. And then this means an average frequency of 1.52 events per year. And then the majority of these events were relatively brief. And then the median of the duration was 1.8 hours. And then the mean was 2.2 hours. Notably, a significant portion of these events occurred during the summer months of July and August, and then mostly during the morning hours. Next slide, please. So our first analysis look at the backup performance of the solar+storage system for all simulated power interruptions for each of the three load configurations. The system successfully served the entire limited critical load for 82% of the simulated events. But then the critical loads, in the case of the entire critical loads, 52% of the simulation events were covered. And in the case of the whole buildings, only 43% of the entire simulated events were covered. This result suggests that a 10 kilowatt-hour battery with a 5% reliability threshold and no grid charging from the main grid may not be sufficient for protecting against short and localized power interruptions in Maricopa. Other strategies, such as programming the battery to retain additional charging reserve, charging the battery from the grid during off-peak hours, or reducing energy consumption during interruptions, may be needed to better mitigate the interruptions, the short duration and localized power interruptions. Next page, please. The ability of a solar+storage system to provide backup power during short duration and localized power interruptions may depend on how long the interruption occurs. And then this figure on the right shows the fitted trend line and then the confidence interval of how backup performance varies with the interruption duration for the critical load backup scenario. Even for the events less than 1 hour, the PVSS modeled here serves the critical load with a probability slightly above 75% on average. And then the backup performance generally declines with increasing duration, but there is an upturn after 8 hours. Next page, please. To better understand the factors influencing the PVSS performance, we begin by examining the impacts of the initial battery state of charge. So as shown in the top figure on the right, the backup performance remains relatively constant for the initial state of charge values up to 50%. But then beyond that point, backup performance rises with the initial state of charge. However, even at the initial state of charge of 100%, the system could not meet all the critical load requirements. This suggests that there is a mismatch between battery sizing and then the load demands. And then these findings also highlight that the initial state of charge is just one factor affecting the percentage of load served. So to comprehensively understand all this story, we need to explore other variables as well, including the timing of power interruptions and then the specific load requirements during those interruptions. Next slide, please. So the previous finding basically led us to analyze the impacts of the timing of the interruptions on PVSS backup performance. And then as can be seen from the figure on the right side, performance is lowest for the interruptions during early evening hours in warm months. This means that little charge was remain for the interruption starting in the early evening hours after the sun has set. And then this is compounded by the fact that the air conditioning load is often substantial during those hours. In addition, as noted earlier, most interruptions in Maricopa occur during early morning hours in July and August. Backup performance during those hours typically hovers around 75% of the load served, as the battery has limited charge during those hours before sunrise. This result suggests that reserving more power for year-round evening and summer morning outages could be beneficial in effectively mitigating the impacts of power interruptions. Next slide, please. Yep. And there are several strategies that can be used to improve backup power performance. And then here in this case study, we consider two of them. The first one is installing larger batteries. And then here we consider the PVS system with a 30 kilowatt hour battery storage. And then the second one is charging the batteries from the grid instead of doing so exclusively with the PV generation. As you can see from the figures, both strategies substantially improve backup performance. Notably, the grid charging case outperforms the larger battery. And then, but then in neither cases, PVSS was not able to provide complete backup for heating and cooling loads in all interruptions. There could be additional strategies for improving backup performance that we did not explore here, such as holding some portion of the battery capacity in reserve for possible power interruptions, or adjusting thermostat set points, or otherwise reducing loads during power interruptions. Next slide, please. Finally, we explored how PVSS system backup performance during short duration interruptions can vary regionally. So we compared the result across typical single family homes in Los Angeles, Maricopa, and Middlesex. So interruption patterns differ across the counties. So in case of Los Angeles and Middlesex, power interruptions occur relatively equal probability across hours of the day. So the average state of the charge of the battery at the beginning of the interruptions is usually higher than Maricopa. So, and then in case of the Maricopa, interruptions were more concentrated in early morning hours. And then these times, battery state of charge tends to be lower. Next page, please. And then when examining the backup performance of these three counties, in these three cases, we observed that Los Angeles and Middlesex outperforms Maricopa's results. This difference can be attributed to several factors. First, both Los Angeles and Middlesex have significantly lower cooling loads than Maricopa. And then second, power interruptions in Maricopa tend to be concentrated in the early morning hours, but then the outages in the interruptions in other two counties were more evenly distributed throughout the day. And then finally, the time of use rate structures used for each of the counties were different. And then, for example, the Middlesex's time of use rate has a broad peak range from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. And then this results in more distributed charging and discharging patterns compared to the other two regions, which has peak period for the sufficiently short duration, and then the rates are much higher than the off-peak region, off-peak times. With that, I will turn things over to JP for the Q&As.
All right, Grace and He. We have a number of questions that have come in, and I think we'll take a stab at answering them in order. I'm going to take a stab at this first one, which seems to be from someone that has some internal knowledge, because it cites the ICE Calculator 2.0, which is under development. The ICE Calculator, for folks that may not have heard of it, is an interruption cost estimator calculator, which is a tool that's survey-based and provides values of lost load for different areas in the country and for different customer segments. And the question asks how PRESTO relates to this forthcoming new version of the ICE calculator, in terms of identifying the reliability and resilience value of SV storage. I don't know what exactly SV may mean, and other DERs. I think what I can say, and this is a good question to clarify a few things, is that there are maybe 3 pieces here that I want to make sure we're all on the same page and how they interact. On one hand, we have a model like PRESTO or any data source that describes the short duration interruption profile for any place in the country. Essentially, what is the customer experience from a technical perspective? Then we have the model that we developed for this particular case study that he described, which is one of many possible models you can use to dispatch a storage unit that is looking to mitigate the impacts of these interruptions. And in their particular case, as he described, this storage unit is operating based on a time of use rate, so it's trying to minimize bills, and then suddenly an interruption hits, and the state of charge at the time of that interruption is, of course, dependent on the operation of the storage system and the PV system that is coupled to it. So that's a separate model. Galen earlier in the presentation started showcasing a separate model that we developed where we do this on a resilience basis for long duration interruptions. And that particular model does not include a time of use treatment. It's assuming that the state of charge is generally 100% because consumers, as Galen described, typically can anticipate most of these interruptions. And so it's a reasonable assumption to make that the system is fully available. The third piece is monetizing the impacts of mitigation or interruption, and hence the impacts of mitigation. And that's where the value of lost load come. When you have the PRESTO input describing the types of interruptions that you can be affected, and that, of course, implies a certain duration and a certain energy that is not served. And then you couple that with a model that is describing how a mitigation strategy like solar+storage can reduce that energy not served. The final step is to value that energy that's not served. And that's where a model or a tool like ICE calculator comes in to monetize those kilowatt hours into dollars. And that way you can move into benefit cost analysis of mitigation strategies. So with that framework, that is essentially the way I would couple PRESTO and ICE 2.0, is that PRESTO is a technical description of interruption profiles, and ICE 2.0 is a monetary a tool to monetize both the impact of these interruptions as well as the benefits of a mitigation strategy. So Galen, if you folks want to take any of these other questions, you feel free to jump in. I'm going to, I think this one, I click here. Okay, I did this. I'm going to tackle this third question that came, that asks if it's fair to say that PRESTO is a generative model that generates power outage profiles that look similar to historical outages profiles from POUS, the power outages.us data, sort of like a GAN for images. I think this is sort of trying to frame if PRESTO could be something like a, ChatGPT for interruptions. And in some ways, yes, in some others, no. It is definitely not as sophisticated. There are many aspects of actual interruption profiles that PRESTO may not be capturing. For example, the fact that at the county level, that is our best resolution so far, you cannot really capture the subtle differences between underground and overhead infrastructure. So customers that are served majoritarily by underground infrastructure tend to have frequencies that are much smaller and durations that on average are a little bit longer, but because whenever there is an interruption on an underground system, it takes longer to restore it. So those are kinds of things, for example, that a more sophisticated model could do, potentially a model that is a generative, but that PRESTO is not yet able to capture. But in some ways, as I said at the beginning, yes, so PRESTO, it is indeed taking a bunch of historical training data and producing this sort of shapes that look similar. So in some way, it does perform similarly, like one of those generative models like OpenAI has developed. Let's see, it's a lot of questions here.
Yeah, I can answer to Josh's question. So in case of the EIA A61's calibration, we use the reliability metrics with major event days And then if there is any power interruption simulated over 24 hours, then we cut them off in the analysis. And
Perfect.
then for the anonymous attendee asking about the geographic the granularity, yes, the FIPS level, the county level is the highest level for the granularity for Presto at this point.
I'll complement that. The Presto in itself, in its logic, does not preclude using higher resolution data. Is really the training data that we have available. If we ever had smart meter data at the customer level for many customers across the country, of course, we could do a much better job at producing customer level interruptions that are very specific to that particular location, and potentially we characterize much, do a much richer characterization of the types of interruptions that customers can suffer, but that's not yet a possibility at this point. I'll take a stab at this question here. If is there anything to consider when using Presto to analyze outages for CNI customers? That's a good question, in that it goes back to maybe some of the aspects that I was describing earlier, that Presto may not necessarily capture specific topological features that of the systems that do supply CNI customers. So CNI customers tend to be have either own their own distribution transformer and have no low voltage grids that are supplying them, especially larger customers. Some very large CNI customers have even their own feeders coming out of substations, and those could be even underground for maximum reliability. So those customized reliability benefits that CNI customers usually pay for would not be immediately captured by Presto. Those are the cases where the user would know what is the particular experience, at least on average, for those customers, and would input SAIDIs and SAIFIs that describe those customers' reliability experience in a more accurate way, and then override the default calibrations that we have. The model will still be able to produce interruptions in a frequency and duration that is characteristic of a county, but with a calibrated duration and frequency, then those will be shortened or made less frequent if that is the case for this particular CNI customer. I'm going to tackle one earlier question that asks, did you look at any longer duration pluses and minuses? My impression is that ICE 1.0 only looks at 24-hour effects, but a longer look could be helpful in some instances. So I think this goes maybe to our prior work that Galen was showcasing, resilience work, where indeed we're looking at much longer duration interruptions. That work does not do an economic valuation of the mitigation impacts of solar plus storage. It remains technical. And so in some ways, the application of ICE doesn't quite come in. We do have a separate paper that we're releasing soon, where we do analyze the economic benefits of solar plus storage, and we do develop a method to extrapolate ICE values, or values of loss load, that are typically for 24 hours or less. We do develop a method to extrapolate those into longer duration interruptions. So that's an upcoming paper, probably in the next couple of weeks will be out. And so I'll advise to be on the lookout. That particular paper does not use Presto, but it does hinge or leverage all the work that we have developed as part of the CETO effort related to characterizing the mitigation or backup potential of solar plus storage. I'm going to tackle this one by Jim. How does Presto perform regarding analysis of in front of the meter storage for utility scale solar and battery storage systems? That's an interesting question, in that from a Presto perspective, and maybe this question I might have already answered by explaining clearly these three different pieces: the Presto role, the dispatch model role, and then the value of loss load values. And in particular, an in front of the meter system would potentially be subject to the same types of interruptions, or be seeing the same type of interruption than behind the meter. It will be local interruptions in that segment or circuit of the distribution system. And the main difference is, I would say, in the dispatch model, where the in front of the meter storage system will be dispatched and operated differently, both before an interruption is occurring, and then while an interruption is occurring. So the utility will have other incentives and other objectives to operate the system. For example, it may be operating mostly to supply peak demand power, to minimize losses, or to prevent overloading. It might not be following a time of use rate of sorts. And so I would say that more than Presto is the dispatch model that would be probably producing the main differences in that kind of assessment. Just want to reiterate for Galen and he to jump in as you see fit. If there's questions, keep coming.
Yeah. Maybe I can answer to Mazier's question then. So the question was about whether we can introduce the grid reliability factor in the Presto to test potential network upgrades or system outage duration and/or frequency. So if there is any reliability and resilience investment that can reduce the duration or frequency of the power interruptions, then Presto can be you can definitely update the inputs of the Presto by providing the numbers. For example, like if you're undergrounding the power lines, let's assume that the undergrounding can reduce the duration of the power interruptions or frequencies by 80%, then you can update the inputs of the Presto with that potential like reliability improvements, and then you can rerun the Presto model, and then you can get the outage logs from before and after the reliability and resilience the investments. And then maybe those information can be useful to understand the potential benefits of the reliability and resilience investment.
All right, I'm going to tackle this interesting question. It says, shouldn't the variable load be incorporated into the storage dispatch decision, not tagged on the simulation results? That's interesting in the sense that the variable load should not necessarily command the dispatch of the storage, but the adoption of the storage. In general, the variable load describes the willingness of a customer to avoid an interruption. And so while it could inform the fact that a customer that is risk averse could have a permanently charged storage unit, that's not really being dispatched in any way, the truth is that the variable load will mostly, as it does in a resource adequacy setting where it commands the amount of capacity that's needed to prevent interruptions at a customer level, it does the same. It will command the size and the adoption of storage units to prevent loss of load. And so the dispatch of the storage unit on a non-interruption setting, more than governed by the variable load, is governed by other economic incentives that are coming through rates. The variable load again is more like acts as a capacity signal more than an energy signal. Potentially could be, if the variable load described a capacity need accurately, it could be used to avoid a capacity charge, but that's typically also part of a rate. The capacity charge comes from the actual cost of capacity for the system and not from the variable load, which is a customer a value. So I hope that answers that particular question. Very quickly, there's a question here that came: which type of simulation does Presto use if it's Monte Carlo? That's correct. So Presto develops an internal Monte Carlo set of runs, and in that's how it creates this discrete outputs. So the values, and I'm gonna see if I can show this, which I glaze over, and apologies for the quick moving of slides here, but I'm going to go back to this slide that's he introducing here. To the upper right is where you can see the table, a tabular output of the Presto model. So each row here is describing one specific event, interruption event, that is clustered in several, or that describes a set of who are clustered in a year. So the sim column here describes 1 year, the simulation 1, and there are 3 interruptions in this particular year, interruptions 1, 2, and 3, and each one of those is characterized by a week, day, and hour in which it occurred, and a duration that characterizes it. And so, as you can see, this is some Monte Carlo output of the random draws that we're doing from the different probability distribution that characterize the likelihood of events in that particular area. I'm going to tackle this one by Charles. If relevant to this webinar, how does one ideally size battery storage for a 3 to 5 megawatt community solar project, for example, in the sunny East San Francisco Bay Area? How to monetize and maximize arbitrage benefits? So there's a lot I can say there, and perhaps I'm going to let Galen describe a little bit how we moved from our prior static storage design to year 2 work, where we implemented a dynamic storage sizing system, and I think that will illuminate some aspects of the question. Then I can bring in some of the lessons we learned from actually a community solar analysis that we performed for C2 as well in a different project.
Yeah, so I can maybe very obliquely address this question. I think, Charles, I mean, your question about how to sort of size a storage system for this sort of arbitrage application, I mean, that's the sort of question that NREL's REOPT tool is often used for. I think our analysis is really focused on backup power applications. And as JP alluded to, some of the work we've been doing is it's structured in a way that it answers the question, how big of a battery do you need to provide backup to certain loads for certain duration or frequencies of outages? And so some of the work that we've been doing, this is looking at long duration power interruptions, asks and kind of analyzes how battery sizing might be impacted as buildings become more electrified, particularly as homes adopt electric space heating and other electric end uses. So that's an area that we've done some work. It's really been focused mostly on the residential sector. We haven't looked so much at community solar projects, but certainly electrification is a big consideration at whatever scale you're looking at. I might also just take the opportunity, since I'm talking here, to address another question here about one of the participants or audience members asked, is it possible that in the evening outage case, augmentation of discharge capability with V2G storage could be the solution rather than increasing the stationary battery size? And that's also something that we've looked at, again, mostly in the context of long duration power interruptions, where there are cases where you would need a really large battery to mitigate a long duration power interruption, particularly if you've got a lot of electrified space heating. And so in cases like that, rather than having, say, 100 kilowatts of stationary battery storage, if you've got an electric vehicle fully charged sitting in your garage, that might be a more economical option. And so certainly, especially I think in the case of long duration power interruptions in certain parts of the country, bidirectional electric vehicles could be really an important enabling technology for backup power applications. That's not something that we've really looked at so far for these short duration events, but I think the example that you cite here is certainly one case.
All right, thanks, Galen. I'll complement that one with this recent community solar work, where we have a model that is able to simulate the distribution system impacts of distributed resources in general, and so essentially interconnection costs. And one of the strategies that the model can deploy is deploying a battery to potentially mitigate interconnection costs for a large community solar project like the one that you're suggesting. So in that case, it is a separate model that is looking right now from the utility perspective. So how do you minimize the cost impacts of the community solar project? In future work, we expect to program in the community solar perspective, in which the community solar, as you indicate, doesn't really particularly or only care about minimizing costs to the utility. It wants to maximize its arbitrage benefits, or more generally, it wants to maximize its net benefits, which is all the benefits that it can accrue from selling solar power minus the interconnection costs. So ideally, we'll get to that point. So that's to say, we're working actively in this space on analyzing the impacts of solar plus storage for these larger community solar projects embedded in distribution systems. The final question that I'll tackle is a good one. Asks, into what extent PRESTO accounts for future changes in weather and extreme events, and therefore outages? It's a great question. The short answer is it doesn't. It is almost entirely trained based on historical data, and so it's reflecting, by design, we use relatively recent data. So you saw worth 5 years worth of data, precisely to avoid incorporating very potentially archaic or not up-to-date profiles or interruption profiles for these particular regions. But accounting for future changes would require quite a different approach, because you couldn't rely on outages that have occurred to train the model. You have to do a much more bottom-up modeling. And that's probably in the, let's see if I can go back to the data that I was presenting and saying or decrying that is not ideal. One of those was this third point here, the asset level outage simulation, which is again what distribution system planners do, where they simulate the outage of a given line segment or voltage regulator or another type of infrastructure, and then based on the topology of the feeder, you can determine which customers are affected by that. So that type of bottom-up simulation is where you can tweak the outage rates for these different assets based on these new weather and extreme event patterns. Other types, the other two types that we're laying out here, utility data and smart meter data, are both historical. It's both data that will not reflect these changes. So this is, again, I think, an ongoing area of research. It's a really good point. And we're hoping to, or we're starting to think how we can make the forward-looking version of PRESTO within the sort of approach and strategy that we have based on training data. I think was our last question, and right on time. We are only a couple minutes away from the end of our webinar. If nothing, Galen, do you want to do some sort of wrap up? And I think we do have one final slide, which is our contact information. So, these questions were really good. We appreciate your engagement and your interest, and of course, we'd like to continue these conversations. So here is our contact, and Galen, I'll let you wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, JP. Thanks, Sunhee. Thanks, everyone, for listening in. Hopefully this has been helpful and interesting. As I mentioned at the beginning, we'll be sending out a follow-up email in the next day or two where you can, with information on where you can download the webinar recording as well as the slides. We'll also remind you at that point of where you can find the publications and the PRESTO model itself. If of course, if you have any other questions that you didn't have a chance to ask or haven't yet thought of, please feel free to follow up with us here. So again, thanks all. Really appreciate your joining our webinar, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Thanks, everyone.